You are listening to the Business Talk, a podcast where global voices in academia and leadership come together to spark meaningful conversations. I'm Deepak, joining you from India. It's a real privilege to have Dr. Barbara Kellerman with us today, as she brings her wisdom and research on leadership and followership to our conversation. Dr. Barbara Kellerman is a leading authority on leadership and followership, best known for serving as a founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she was on the faculty for more than 2 decades and now continues as a fellow. Over the course of her career, she has held academic appointments at institutions including Fordham, Tufts, Fairleigh, Dickinson, George Washington, Uppsala, and Christopher Newport universities, as well as Dartmouth College and its Tuck School of Business, and has directed both graduate studies at Fairleigh Dickinson and at the Center for the Advanced Study of Leadership at the University of Maryland. Educated at Sarah Lawrence College and Yale University, Professor Kellerman has been recognized with a Dunford Fellowship, three Fellowships, and the Fulbright Chair in American Studies at Uppsala University. A co-founder of the International Leadership Association, she is the author or editor of influential books such as Bad Leadership, Followership, The End of Leadership, Professionalizing Leadership, and the Leadership from Bad to Worse. Dr. Kellerman's work reaches global audiences through major media outlets and leading publications such as the New York Times and Harvard Business Review. And she has spoken on leadership to audiences in major cities across every continent. Her contributions have been honored with the Wilbur F. McFarley Award from the National Management Association for pioneering work on leadership and followership, and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association. From 2015 through 2024, she has been consistently ranked among Global Guru's World's Top 30 Management Professionals, most recently at number 9 in 2024. Professor Kellerman's forthcoming book, Why We Follow and Why Sometimes We Do Not, to be published by the University of Toronto Press in fall 2026, continues her long-standing exploration of the dynamics between leaders and followers. And now, without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Barbara Kellerman to the conversation. Professor Barbara, thank you for accepting our invitation and taking the time to join this conversation. We are truly honored to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, across your work, from bad leadership to leadership from bad to worse, how has your thinking evolved on what happens inside systems where poor leadership is allowed to fester rather than being confronted early?
So, in leadership from bad to worse, I try to make the point that, first of all, how we define bad leadership depends, of course, on our point of view. So, I may think somebody is a bad boss in the workplace, and you may think it's a great boss. Or similarly, in the world of politics, or in religion, or in education. So, one of the reasons, and I wrote about bad leadership first more than 20 years ago in a book that you mentioned called Bad Leadership. And I've always wondered why what I call the leadership industry is so averse to discussing the subject of bad leadership. And I've finally written about it and came up with several conclusions, one of which is that there is profound disagreement about what constitutes good and bad when you are talking about power and authority and influence. So, bearing that in mind, I've decided that we should not stay away from the subject of bad leadership. We simply need to know how to define it. And I understand that my definition of bad may be different from your definition of bad. Essentially, I define bad as being along two axes. One is ethical to unethical, so you're a bad leader if you're unethical. And the second is effective and ineffective. So essentially, you're a bad leader if you're ineffective. You're a very bad leader if you're both ineffective and unethical. So to return to the question of leadership from bad to worse. After many years of study and observation, I have concluded and found that there is no bad leader, however defined, who wakes up one morning and says, you know, I've been a bad leader. Let's say I've been unethical, I've been corrupt. I'm going to change my ways and I'm going to become an ethical leader. In other words, leaders don't, of their own volition, change. They change only in response to pressure from followers, and that's another characteristic of mine. I treat followers, every bit as being every bit as important as leadership and leaders. Leadership is, after all, a relationship. You cannot have a leader without at least one follower. So the followers need to be taken into account all the time. And they're particularly important with regard to bad leadership. And I will give you just one example. In the United States, we have had a president for one term and now 1 year and a few months by the name of Donald Trump. So many people think that he's a very good leader, and many other people, many other Americans, think he is a rather bad leader. So for those Americans who think he is a bad leader, if they want to change leaders or they want to try to change Donald Trump, which is unlikely, of course, they need to try to do what they can to stop him. So to take one vivid example, tomorrow, by chance, we're having this conversation in my country. It's Friday in the middle of the day. Saturday, that is I think it's the 28th tomorrow, March 28th. There is going to be a massive public protest against Donald Trump. It's the third No King's Day. And No King's Day means a lot of people, a lot of Americans are going to take to the streets to protest the man they think would be king. So bottom line, Leadership from Bad to Worse is a book. It's my most recent book, which is all about how unless bad leaders, however defined, are stopped by their followers, that bad leadership will, I guarantee it, go from being bad to being worse.
Professor, in your book, Why We Follow Leaders and Why We Don't, what have you learned about the everyday psychological triggers that make ordinary people resist rather than obey, even very powerful leaders?
So it's an incredibly interesting question. And as you mentioned in your introduction, the question of, it's easy enough to understand why leaders want to lead. Everybody wants to study to be a leader. I want to make more money. I want to be on top of the organization, not at the bottom. So that's easy enough to understand, and people have written about it for many years. What's less easy to understand, and that's what my new book is about, Why We Follow Leaders and Why We Don't. What's less easy to understand is why we follow leaders. What's in it for us? Why do we go along with leaders? Sometimes it's easy to understand because leaders, if we do not go along with them, if they have the power to punish us, then let's say in even dangerous ways, not just to punish us in the workplace, but to punish us politically, sometimes even by imprisonment and death in the political world. So that's relatively easy to understand. Harder to understand is the rewards for going along with good leaders. Again, in the workplace, sometimes it's obvious we get more money or we get a promotion. But there are a lot of other times when both the rewards and the punishments are not so obvious. And to return to a word that you used earlier, sometimes these rewards and punishments are material, tangible, but as you implied when you used the word psychological in your question to me, sometimes the rewards and the punishments are intangible. They are psychological. Let's just, this is an incredibly complicated, although endlessly interesting question. Let's say for the purposes of this exchange, the rewards for following leaders are often those of needing to have a leader. We cannot have a leaderless organization or a leaderless nation or even a town or community for very long. Humans are great apes. All great apes, like humans, have leaders, people at the top to keep the group together. Without some kind of leadership, the group flies apart. Followers are not comfortable without any leadership whatsoever. So, in the end, we sometimes opt even for bad leaders in preference to having no leaders at all.
Professor, in your book, The End of Leadership, you argued that traditional leadership is in crisis. Looking back now, do you feel that followers have become even more powerful since you wrote the book? Or has the myth of the strong leader reasserted itself?
So it's another huge question, and I will do my best to answer it relatively briefly and simply. I wrote The End of Leadership about 12 years ago. And interestingly, it came out around the same time as another similar book, which came out a little bit later than mine, called The End of Power by a man named Moise Naim. So, what were we talking about? We were talking about an era in which followers, that is, ordinary people, both, again, these trends are across countries and they are across sectors. Everything I say applies to the private sector, to the public sector, to the not-for-profit sector. It applies to the United States and to Canada, to Russia and to India, to Brazil and to Argentina. These are global trends related to the times in which we live, and it is correct to say that in the early 2000s, followers around the world were gaining power while leaders around the world were losing it. Again, a complicated question. I will summarize it by saying that in liberal democracies, one could argue that followers became too powerful, leaders became too weak, and that explains to some degree why in the West, in liberal democracies, in the United States and in Europe, and indeed in India to a degree as well, we have seen in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years a swing to the right, to more autocratic leaders. The swing to autocratic leaders is in response to a culture in which it was implicitly experienced, not so often explicitly addressed, that followers were becoming, as I said, too powerful, and that people were becoming uncomfortable with this. Similarly, in autocratic cultures, and I'll particularly mention Russia and China, because of the same syndrome, which was enhanced by technology. In other words, ordinary people on social media now have a far louder and more prominent voice than they did even 20 years ago, not to speak of 120 years ago. Because followers have become noisier and more demanding and more difficult, leaders like Putin, like Russia's President Vladimir Putin, and China's President Xi Jinping have understood that unless they become more oppressive, more repressive, their followers will start taking to the streets and protesting. So if you look at the trajectory of President Xi Jinping and you look at the trajectory of President Vladimir Putin, and in Turkey also President Recep Erdogan, all of them have in the last decade become much more repressive because they have understood that if they did not, their followers would become more powerful, and indeed so powerful they would be difficult to keep down.
Professor, the book enables examine how Team Trump handled the pandemic. What broader lessons about enabling bad leadership should citizens, boards, and senior teams take from that episode so they do not repeat similar failures in future crises?
Okay, I want to be sure I understand your question. Can you repeat it, please?
Sure. The enablers examine how Team Trump handled the pandemic, what broader lessons about enabling bad leadership should citizens, boards, and senior teams take from that episode so they do not repeat similar failures in future crises?
So, are you talking particularly about President Donald Trump?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the interesting thing about Trump is that he has been a polarizing figure. In particular, many Americans have long disliked Donald Trump intensely. But similarly, many Americans have long been fervent supporters of Donald Trump. So, first of all, to the surprise of many Americans, he was elected president for the first time in 2016. He had no expertise in government whatsoever, and he had no political experience whatsoever. Nevertheless, he was elected in 2016. Then, of course, as you very well know, and your listeners very well know, he was reelected in 2024. The first time around, he had what we call some guardrails. In other words, enough old time Republican establishment figures to keep him more or less in line. The second time around, for various reasons which we don't have time to go into, those guardrails have disappeared. And Trump is, of course, also 4 years older. He's now not far from 80 years old. He has become more himself, if that's the right way of expressing it, less constrained by anyone or anything. And so he does more or less what he wants to do when he wants to do it. Republican members of our legislature have been completely compliant. In other words, his own party has in no way restrained him. And Democrats have been unable to do very much about anything, including the war in the Middle East, which is going on rather aggressively as you and I are having our conversation. But again, to explain Donald Trump, it doesn't do any good only to look at those who dislike him. It's extremely important to remember that both among the American people and among many elected political officials, he has had not only a strong base of ardent support, but legislative followers in particular who have been more or less 100%, particularly in the second term, compliant with what he wants to do when he wants to do it. I will simply say that for an observer of leadership like me, a global leadership, and of course, since I'm an American, particularly leadership in the United States, it will be quite interesting for me, or indeed very interesting for me, to see how this plays out in the next 2.5 years. Trump has more than 2.5 years to go yet in his second term. For those among us, for those Americans who think he has already gone from bad to worse, and that unless he is checked, he will go from even worse to still worse in the next 2.5+ years, that could be a time that is not just very interesting, but also very difficult. And the war, however it turns out, and as we have this conversation on March 27th, it's impossible to know how it's going to turn out. But however it goes, it is looking quite complicated at this moment. And by the way, for people in India, very much so as well. There are, I don't have to tell you, many, many, many Indians living in the Middle East. India is very heavily dependent on energy, particularly oil, brought in from outside sources. So to have something as simple, seemingly simple, as the Strait of Hormuz largely closed to global shipping is not good for India, nor is it good for anyone else anywhere in the world. But how the problem will be resolved, your guess, I admit, is as good as mine.
Professor, drawing on leaders who lust and women and leadership, how do different types of lust for power, legacy, and legitimacy play out differently for men and women leaders in public life today?
So you're touching on what some people regard as a third rail, which is gender differences between male and female leaders. It's interesting that you're asking this question of me today. I have written quite widely. I've written on many different aspects and spoken about many different aspects of leadership. Women in leadership is certainly one of them. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I will simply say that I am struck, and anybody who thinks about this, again, we are living in a time of war. As wars go, the war in the Middle East is not a particularly big one, but it is a particularly dangerous one for various obvious reasons. I would simply point out that the war is being conducted entirely by men. There is no woman who is involved in any visible role on any side, whether it is Iran, whether it is Israel, whether it is the United States, whether it is the Gulf countries, whether it is nearly any country around the world. Overwhelmingly, we are in the year 2026. Overwhelmingly, countries, nations are still being led by men. And indeed, of the thousands of military members who are in some way involved already in the war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine and Russia, all over, these are very, very, very largely male endeavors. That is one of the profound differences. Again, we are like great apes. In general, great ape communities are led by men. Fighting is largely conducted by men, or I should say by the male of the species. And even though we have made, in many ways, strides with regard to women and leadership, in the world of politics, they lag incredibly, women lag incredibly far behind. And I might as well add that when you come to leadership in the private sector, it is not very different. So of the American Fortune 500 companies, in the year 2026, less than 10%, 8 or 9%, are led by women.
Professor, in your book, Hard Times, Leadership in America and Reinventing Leadership, you connect politics and business. What is one dangerous similarity and one crucial difference you see between political leaders and corporate CEOs in how they wield power?
Well, I think, again, the trends I speak of apply across the board. In other words, the impact of followers on leaders, the fact that it grew in the early 2000s, applied as much to leaders in the private sector as in the public sector. I will, for the purpose of this question, I will confine my comments to leaders in the West. And that includes India, by the way, but I'm talking particularly about the United States. Leadership is much more difficult, no matter the gender, no matter private sector or public sector. Leadership in liberal democracies, if you look, for example, at leadership in Great Britain. So leaders in Great Britain used to serve, the prime ministers used to serve, let's say, for the sake of this exchange, 10 years. Tony Blair was prime minister for 10 years, approximately, as was Margaret Thatcher, et cetera, et cetera. In recent years, they have been lucky if they can survive. Prime ministers, British prime ministers, have been lucky if they can survive 2 years. Boris Johnson was prime minister for between 2 and 3 years. Theresa May was prime minister between 2 and 3 years. Liz Truss was prime minister for 6 weeks. Rishi Sunak did not last as prime minister for 2 years. He was out after a year and a half. Right now we have Keir Starmer, whose popularity ratings are in the basement. Similarly, in the United States, we have two-term presidents. Donald Trump is a two-term president, But in general, including in the private sector, in the educational sector, in the religious sector, leader tenure has shrunk. Leader tenure is shrinking, to return to a point that I made earlier, because followers are more demanding, they are more restive, they are nastier and more critical. They have vehicles, particularly social media, on which they can express their anger, their discontent, their resentment of leaders. So in liberal democracies generally, whether in the public sector, the private sector, the educational sector, my own university, Harvard, is a good example. We have had ridiculously high leader turnover just in the last few years. Generally, it is far more difficult to lead. Leaders are well rewarded. Do not misunderstand. In particular, with regard to money, they get amply compensated. But the other kinds of rewards, the respect they get, for example, has enormously diminished. Hence, their tenure at the top has diminished at the same time.
Professor, you edited volumes such as Leadership Essential Selections on Power, Authority, and Influence and Leadership, Multidisciplinary Perspectives, brings many disciplines together. If you had to redesign leadership studies from scratch, which two disciplines would you put at the core and which popular lens would you drop?
So if I were designing a leadership from scratch, I'm going to actually mention a book that I don't think you've mentioned, which is called Professionalizing Leadership. That book came out in 2018. It was published by Oxford University Press. And in that book, I, I take issue with, I criticize what I call the leadership industry, which seems to convey to its customers, its clients, its students, that leadership can be taught quickly and easily. There is no evidence that leadership can be taught quickly and easily, any more than being a physician can be taught quickly and easily, or being a lawyer. So if I were designing a leadership curriculum from scratch, I would begin with education. What does a leader's education consist of? In my view, it should consist of the liberal arts, of literature, of philosophy, yes, some of the social sciences, psychology. It would be the equivalent of an outstanding undergraduate curriculum. Then you go from education to training, where leaders learn the particular craft of the area in which they need to lead. If I'm going to become an educational leader, I should know something about, let's say I'm in the United States, higher education and education from K through 12 in the United States of America. What are the skill set that I'm going to need in order to be a good educational leader in the United States of America in the middle of the 21st century? So first step, education. Second step, training. And the last step I call leadership development. What is leadership development? It is continuing education. Doctors now cannot get a medical degree in 2026 and assume they never have to learn anything else, because medicine is changing so rapidly that they need to keep on having a continuing education. The same thing with other professions. Same thing with vocations. You cannot learn to be an auto mechanic in 2026 and think that repairing a car in 2036 is going to be exactly the same. So it should be with leaders. So leaders should have a rigorous education. They should have rigorous training after the education, and they should have built into their leadership growth an ongoing, continuing education where they understand the world is changing and that in order to lead wisely and well, they need to understand that the world is changing and the ways in which they need to change to accommodate changes in the context. For example, in the age of artificial intelligence, leadership is almost certainly going to look different in 2030 from what it did even in 2010, not to speak of 1980. So leaders need to have continuing education every bit as much as doctors do.
Professor Barbara, before we wrap up, one final question. Going back to making decisions and leadership and negotiation in the Middle East, what have you learned about the role of followers, publics, and non-allied actors in high-stakes negotiations that standard leadership textbooks still tend to ignore?
So I hope I understand your question correctly. I think, are you asking me about the role of followers in yeah. So again, there are two ways in which I deviate from my colleagues. One is I have spent a lifetime as interested in bad leadership as in good leadership. And the second, I have spent a professional lifetime as interested in followers as I am in leaders. As I said earlier, they are as intrinsic to the leadership relationship. I always talk about the leadership system. I never talk about an individual leader. The leadership system has three parts. One is leaders. They're very important. I'm not saying they're unimportant. Two is followers, who are every bit as important. And three is the context within which leaders and followers are situated. So while India and the United States have many similarities, they have profound differences, which makes leading and following in the United States very different from leading and following in India. I am always talking about the importance of followers. I believe they need to be engaged and alert and attentive, and that they do bear responsibility for what happens in the leadership relationship. This is not just about single individuals who are dominant with all the power, all the authority, and all the influence. The fact that leadership is a relationship should communicate to ordinary people that they do have a voice, and that that voice is very important, although I am not an idiot and I recognize that sometimes that voice is difficult to express.
As we come to a close, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Barbara for truly illuminating conversation. Professor, your reflections on leadership, context, and our current moment have given us much to think about. And I know our listeners will carry these insights into their own work and lives. Thank you so much for so generously sharing your time and your scholarship and your perspective with us today. It's been a pleasure and honor to host you on the podcast, and we look forward to learning from your work in the years ahead. Thank you once again, Professor.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation and I very much appreciate the excellent questions. Very nice to meet you. Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you.